Reality consists of premises. One of the Nobel Prize winners, I think his name is Robert Aumann, who specializes in game theory. So he runs the Center for Rationality. I think it's in the Ben Gurion University in Israel. And he applies game theory to the Mideast crisis and consistently says the worst things you can do is offer those whose premise is insane compromise, because you don't bring them closer to reality, you bring them further. He was once in a conference and someone said to him, "Do you think that the terrorists are rational?" So he said, "Yes." So the reporter said, "How can you say they're rational when they're so evil?" He says, "I didn't say they're moral, I said they're rational." You see, the terrorists have a premise that you are evil. It's exactly like Hitler taught the Germans to see basically everyone who's not part of their race as inferior, and based on the premise was that there was meant to be a super race that was meant to dominate all other races. Islam has the same premise, that Islam must dominate all others. And so once you understand the premise, then the actions are actually quite rational. Now they may be, in your point of view, wrong, but that's because you don't share their premise. And so what we actually are dealing with is different premises. As I think Senator Mendes said in a speech to Congress, that it's about time we take our side in the story. In other words, for a person to simply say that I'm going to accept every other premise but my own is effectively to say two things. Number one, I have no premise. And number two, I have no ability to think and choose. And so therefore we have to analyze what are the different premises in this world, and we have to discern which premise is true and which premise isn't true. And I'd go so far to say that it actually doesn't make a difference in terms of which is or isn't true. You know, whether Muhammad or Jesus or Moses was or wasn't a prophet probably doesn't make a difference. What does make a difference is, what does their prophecy cause? A very great genius told me, he's actually Christian, so to him it was a complication, but in the end of the day, Martin Luther, who's very respected by many Christians, wrote books, and his books caused basically like a civil war in Germany. You know, Obama, you might think he was a good guy, but what did he cause? He caused a racial divide and a great segregation, not unity in America. So when you look at the outcome of the premise, you're able to judge if this is a good premise or a bad premise. And so what really behooves anybody who cares about their life and life in general is to look at what are the different premises that are going on, and look at the outcomes of those premises and decide for yourself which premise do you desire and which premise do you not desire. So there are a couple of obvious premises, and let's start with the big ones. So one of the big premises, of course, is the premise of democracy. Now, what's obviously if you take democracy, there are different versions of democracy. So there's the way the French look at democracy, which is equality. And then there's the way that Americans look at democracy, which is freedom from tyranny. And so perhaps the greatest statement ever made was when they asked Rabbi Joseph Isaac Schneerson about which political system is closest to Judaism. So he said the good in all of them. Because all of our Western societies are built on another premise, and that is the biblical premise. And the biblical premise is quite simple. It's exactly what God says in the Bible. I've chosen Abraham because he will teach his children the way of justice and kindness. So Judaism and what we call the Judeo-Christian ethic boils down to two things. It boils down to justice and kindness. And that's why in countries that follow the Judeo-Christian principle, you find the respect for law and you find the respect for charity and compassion. Now this is very interesting. There are other countries that do not have that premise, and I'm not going to pretend that I fully understand cultures that I don't. But for example, I've heard that in Japan you can walk by, some people are millionaires and other people are dying on the street and they have no compassion. I lived in Africa, and even though I can say there's a certain sweetness, but there's also a very clear savagery. And so it's very interesting. I mean, I think that the job of focusing on who different societies are and their cultures, their beliefs, is a sociologist, and it would take us too much time. But if I had to sum it up with a very, very important message, the message is that just because someone sounds rational does not mean that they are, because they may be based on a premise, but the premise itself may be based, as in Nazism, as in jihadist thinking, on pure ego, which is the desire to dominate others, to subjugate others. Whereas the Judeo-Christian principle is a principle to respect the value of your own life, respect the value of another person's life, and as a rabbi, this is one field that I'm qualified to speak about. Behind the entire Judeo-Christian, at least certainly Judeo-ethic, lies another premise, which is the dignity of the individual. In other words, when they asked one of our great rabbis, Hillel, what is the basis, the essential core of Judaism, he said, that which you don't want others to do to you, don't do to them. And the commentaries explain the one thing that we should never do, that we never want done, is to be ashamed and, God forbid, to shame.